Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Raimundo Pérez Hernández, director de la Fundación Ramón Areces, y quisiera darles a todos ustedes la bienvenida. Dos especiales bienvenidas, una a José María Benito, al profesor José María Benito, catedrático de Jean Monnet de la Unión Europea, profesor visitante en la Universidad de Harvard y colaborador de nuestra fundación. Y una bienvenida muy especial al profesor Peter Hall, profesor de Estudios Europeos de la Fundación Krupp en la Universidad de Harvard y miembro del cuerpo docente del Centro de Estudios Europeos Minda de Gunzburg. Ha escrito extensamente sobre economía política comparada, política europea, formulación de políticas públicas, metodologías de las ciencias sociales y el papel de las instituciones y las ideas en la política. Bienvenida otra vez, profesor Hall, y muchas gracias por estar hoy y acompañarnos en este acto. ¿Cómo cambian las economías políticas? En las décadas posteriores a la Segunda Guerra Mundial, las economías políticas occidentales han cambiado drásticamente, ya que las fuentes del crecimiento económico y las formas en que se ha gestionado la economía han cambiado. La conferencia de hoy rastreará el movimiento de estas estrategias de crecimiento a través de 3 eras de modernización, liberalización y crecimiento basado en el conocimiento. ¿Qué impulsa cambios importantes en las estrategias de crecimiento? Se trata, sin duda ninguna, de un tema apasionante, de gran actualidad en un mundo cada vez sujeto a mayores interrogantes, tanto a corto como a medio y largo plazo. Las actuales incertidumbres generadas por la pandemia de la COVID-19, las tensiones territoriales resucitadas en Europa y la reaparición de variables económicas casi olvidadas como la inflación y la subida de tipos de interés contribuyen a que nos replanteemos las bondades, los efectos y las perspectivas de las concepciones políticas e ideológicas que nos gobiernan. Pensábamos que estos debates tan de actualidad hace unas docenas de años ya se habían resuelto, pero comprobamos una vez más que las instituciones y su estructura no son inmunes a la evolución del mundo, de la sociedad y la economía. Pocos temas de naturaleza transversal como este son tan interesantes y tan atractivos. Muchísimas gracias de estar hoy con nosotros. Muchas gracias. Profesor Benito.
Muchas gracias, querido director, querido Raimundo, por estas palabras de introducción. Thank you very much, Professor Hall, to be today with us here at the Fundación Ramón Areces. You may know that the Fundación Ramón Areces has an extensive background and trajectory, particularly in the sciences, in the hard sciences, and now for a number of years also in the social sciences. It's one of those institutions which has emerged out of a successful business, El Corte Inglés, which has put into the service of Spanish and European international community in general, quite a number of resources, quite important resources, in order to foster research, to create and to foster communities of scientists, and this the Foundation has been doing now for quite a number of years. So we are very grateful, really, that the Fundación Ramón Areces now for the last time also gets more and more involved into the social sciences, into international relations, political economy. Professor Hall, as you will know, is a very senior and distinguished professor, Krupp Foundation professor at the Harvard University, specialized in political economy, particularly the interaction between economy, government, capitalism and democracy, and also in recent years he has developed a broad interest in the resilience of societies. A book authored with Professor Lamont on successful societies, not very far away, not recent years. And he has also, for many, many years, developed particular interest in European politics. European politics from public policy perspective, but also European politics from its economic and political development. Professor Hall, and I must say that with great pleasure, has been director of the Minda Gunzburg Centre for European Studies at Harvard University for quite a number of years. Then he was associate dean at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. So very committed academic, very committed teacher with his students. He has directed quite a number of PhD students. And I had the honor and the pleasure to meet for the first time Professor Hall in the 80s, and since then we have had the opportunity to meet over the years, and since then I have been very benefiting extensively from the research that Professor Hall has been doing. So great pleasure to have you here today with us. The topic that you have chosen couldn't be more to the point, interesting, current. So I let you now with Professor Hall. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Maria, for that a very generous introduction. And I want to thank the Fundación for inviting me to discuss these issues with you today. So the title of my talk, as Jose Maria said, is Capitalism and Democracy, a Dynamic Perspective. But as I think about it, I probably should have called this talk Mission Impossible, if you think of the film, because what I really want to do is to discuss how the political economies of the developed world, especially in Europe and North America, but in the developed world more generally, have changed over the past 75 years. And I want to sketch out an approach to explaining how those changes have taken place. And of course, it's impossible to do this adequately in 50 minutes. So you're going to have to take my remarks as a kind of provocation rather than a complete exposition. And as you wonder, no doubt, where the nuances in my argument are, please bear in mind the observation of the 19th century French poet Paul Valéry, who once said that although every simple statement is false, every complex statement is useless. So I'm trying to steer my way through Scylla and Charybdis there. And with that prologue, I want to share some slides with you. So, there we go. My focus is on what I'm going to call the growth strategies. And by these, I mean the strategies that governments adopt to promote employment, equitable distribution of well-being, and economic growth. And these growth strategies are embodied in the policy regimes, the supporting institutions that governments implement in order to manage the economy, secure continued economic growth. And I'm going to discuss three such strategies, each roughly characteristic of what I think of as distinctive eras in the development of the Western political economies, namely an era of modernization, which runs through the 1950s and 1960s, what I'm going to call an era of liberalization, characteristic of the 1980s and 1990s, and something I'm going to call an era of knowledge-based growth, which really begins around the turn of the 21st century. And of course, the approach I'm going to take here focuses on parallel movements over time across countries. And so it ignores what really are some important national variations that I don't really have time to discuss, although I think the approach that I'm taking here can be helpful for thinking about national variations. And so this question yields the principal puzzle that I want to discuss today. Namely, how do we explain movements over time in these growth strategies as we move from one era to another? And this is not an easy question to answer because it asks how politicians at the apex of democratic political systems manage the challenges that emerge from a capitalist economic regime. But it's an important question for, I think, at least two reasons. First, growth strategies are highly consequential. On the one hand, they affect rates of economic growth and the extent to which governments are able to secure prosperity for their citizens. Of course, other factors influence that as well, but the posture that governments take to the economy is very important for the level of prosperity a society can secure. But on the other hand, growth strategies also affect how the fruits of economic growth are distributed across the population, namely the distribution of income and life chances that follow in some ways from income across the citizens, across the population of a country. And I think that the post-war decline in income inequality and the subsequent rise in inequality from 1980 onwards that you see here in this famous slide from the work of Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, this decline and then rise is not given by some iron law of economics, but it's directly affected by the growth strategies that governments adopt. So that's the first reason why I think we need to think more about what I'm calling growth strategies. But understanding growth strategies is important for a second reason as well. Movements from one strategy to another reflect changes in the relative balance of power between capitalism on the one hand and democracy on the other. I'm going to close my remarks by saying something, just a little bit, about how this balance of power changes over time. So let's turn to the core question here, my puzzle. How do we explain these movements from one growth strategy to another? Now, a good deal has been written about this. I'm not the only person to think about this, and I've learned a lot from the literature. But as I see it, many prominent works tend to miss the importance, and more important, the texture of the politics associated with these movements. And maybe at the risk of doing a bit of violence to the subtlety of some scholars, let me note 4 important analytical approaches to this question of how we move from one growth strategy to another, why we move from one strategy to another, and 4 approaches that I think in one way or another miss the mark here. So the first might be described as economic functionalism. And of course, it's especially prominent in economics. And here, the basic assumption is that the policies governments adopt can be explained by the character of the economic problems they confront. And of course, this is true to some extent, but I think it's also incomplete, not least because of the limited attention it pays to the politics of this movement. A second approach is what I would describe as a kind of political functionalism. This is one that assumes that democratic governments must cater to the needs of capital to address what is often called the accumulation problem, as James O'Connor put it in this famous book about these things. And the idea here is that so if governments must respond to the demands of capital, their policies can be explained as efforts to do that. And once again, I think there is something in this, but in my view, not quite enough to explain just what governments do. A third view approaches this problem in relatively similar terms, but in terms that are historically more subtle. And it explains the policies governments adopt as the product of conflict between the organized representatives of labor on the one hand, the organized representatives of capital on the other. And so growth strategies are driven by the balance of power between labor and capital. And again, as you'll see from what I'm going to say, I think this is not irrelevant, but this focus on the balance of power between the two groups ignores the importance of variation in how each of these groups interpret their interests and how they present those interests. So that's a third possible answer to this question. A fourth view takes this last point seriously, the notion that interests are not just given by the world, but somehow have to be interpreted, and argues that changes in policy are associated primarily with changes in ideas about how the economy should be managed, either because of changes in economic theory or because of changes in the types of advisors that governments consult. And of course, ideas matter a great deal. I've written quite a bit about that. But I think ideas are ultimately only part of the story. So what does my story look like? Excuse me. I'm going to argue that behind the movement from one growth strategy to another lies three necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. And exploiting alliteration here a little bit, I'm going to label these three conditions those associated with the motivation, the means, and the motor for change from one strategy to another. And each of these terms refers to a different set of developments, each of which I think plays a key role in the process whereby growth strategies and political economies more generally change. I think the best way to see what I mean by this is for me to look at the first period that I want to examine here, namely this era of modernization in the 1950s and 1960s, and consider how the growth strategy that dominated that era came about. So if we think about this first era, the French call it les Trente Glorieuses, because of course in Europe in particular, economic growth was particularly rapid in this period. I think the core characteristics of policy, if we generalize across the developed democracies, the core characteristics of policy are relatively familiar to all of us. So leaving aside some variations, national variations that are important, in most of the Western democracies, this was a period when governments made an unprecedented commitment to securing full employment, jobs for everyone. They adopted policies that entailed wide-ranging, really unprecedented levels of state intervention into the economy. And of course, they expanded systems of social benefits, social insurance, to lay the groundwork for what the Bishop of London called in 1948 the welfare state. So in each of these respects, the policies of this early era of modernization marked a significant break from what governments had done for the most part in past decades before the Second World War. So where did the motivation, my first key concept, where did the motivation for this break come from? Well, I think it lay first and foremost in the adverse economic experience, notably of mass unemployment during the 1920s and 1930s. Mass unemployment, which contributed in a significant way to the collapse of the Weimar Republic, the collapse of the Western democracies into World War and Holocaust. And so the post-war cry in the 1940s of never again meant more than no more war. It meant no more mass unemployment. And for European policymakers in particular in this era, I think what Jacques Servan-Schreiber, the French writer, called the American challenge was a secondary but also important factor, inspiring a willingness on the part of the European governments in particular to take radical steps to modernize their economies that now seem threatened by an American colossus that had emerged from the Second World War largely unscathed and now presented them with their most dramatic competitive challenge. So I think that was essentially the driving force, the motivation that gave governments the courage as much as the incentive to try something radically new after the Second World War. So to put this in more general terms, to the terms of construct my analysis, if you like, around this, I think then the motivation for a profound shift in growth strategies typically derives from two sorts of economic developments. The first are economic developments with such profoundly adverse effects that they summon up a sense of crisis, and a sense of crisis with wide political resonance. And of course, political resonance is important here because without that political resonance, we can't expect democratic governments to make a radical break with past policy. And as I've suggested, I think the second type of developments that factor into these, the motivation, if you like, for these movements between growth regimes, second type of factor are developments in the international economy that are profound enough to force firms into different strategies that governments then find they have to accommodate. But motivation is not enough. For radical shifts in policy to take place, policymakers also have to have what I'm calling a means, by which I mean an intellectual rationale for implementing new types of policies. And of course, this is where ideas enter the analysis, notably but not exclusively in the form of economic theories. And of course, if we think back to the 1940s and 1950s, relatively new ideas did gain increasing currency after the Second World War. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes and his followers were responsible for really quite a lot of them, even though few governments actually implemented the kind of countercyclical fiscal policies that Keynes proposed, and those that did generally got mediocre results from it. Nonetheless, the more basic ideas that lie behind a kind of Keynesian view of the economy were very influential, namely the basic idea that capitalist economies are naturally unstable. They're not as stable as classical economic theories once supposed. Secondly, the notion that national economies could be construed in terms of something to be called aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And then thirdly, that governments had a responsibility and also the capacities to secure full employment. And these ideas were taken up with some important variations across much of the Western political economies. I mean, Germany is the most exceptional case. There we see something slightly different, but still a good deal of intervention, still a real break with the past, and still underpinned by a certain set of intellectual ideas, if you like, in this case, the ideas associated with doctrines of ordoliberalism. So we've got motivation, we've got means, but motivation and means are, in my view, still not enough to bring about the kind of profound transformations of the sort that I'm concerned with here. There also had to be what I'm calling a motor. And I think that motor resides in the realm of electoral politics. And we have to look to electoral politics because it's electorates. It's to electorates that democratic governments ultimately have to respond. Yes, those governments listen to advisors. Yes, they're influenced by producer groups, business, labor, and the like. But unless electoral conditions are right, democratic governments are unlikely to take radical action. So the question becomes, well, what is it about electoral conditions that matters most? And in my view, it's what I would call the terms of electoral contestation. That is to say, the set of issues that are pushed to the top of the electoral agenda, because those issues have become the focal point for electoral conflict, for partisan political competition. And although this deserves a longer discussion than I can go into here, in my view, the factor that drives the terms of electoral competition determines what kind of issues will be at the center of the electoral agenda. That factor is the set of political cleavages dominating partisan electoral competition. And I'm going to say something more about this. So in the 1950s and 1960s, broadly speaking in Europe and also even North America, the dominant political cleavage in these countries was a cleavage of social class, a class cleavage, pitting representatives of a largely blue-collar working class against parties that spoke more strongly and organizations that spoke more strongly for the interests of a white-collar middle class. Of course, this is well known to political scientists. You can see some indication of the importance of this cleavage on this slide. And so the effect of this cleavage, as I see it, was to push issues of social justice, issues associated with working class grievances, to the top of the political agenda. And that meant that any party, whether on the center left or the center right, any party seeking office had to address those issues of social justice, working class grievance. And as a result, as we see in the chart on the other side of this slide, as a result, in the 1950s and 1960s, we find that parties of both the political left and the political right moved to the left on economic issues in this period, in a more interventionist, more assertive direction. Now, for some who study political parties, this is a somewhat disconcerting and certainly contestable claim. But my claim is that the main thrust of economic and social policy, when considered over the long term in the way that I'm doing it here, the main thrust of social and economic policy is not driven by the partisan complexion of government, by whether governments are run from the left or from the right. Rather, it's determined in any given era of this sort by the terms of electoral contestation, which are themselves driven by the character of underlying social and political cleavages. So that's the broad analytic framework that I'm using here. I've drawn it out of this first post-war era of modernization. But since those terms are now explicit, I can be briefer about how my argument plays out as we move forward in history, if you like, after the 1960s and 70s, and think about the next two movements in growth strategies I want to discuss. So in my view, the next big movement in policy regimes comes in the 1980s and 1990s as policy shifts for what I'm going to call an era of liberalization. And once again, I think the character of this shift, while there are many details that I'm leaving out, the character of this shift is broadly familiar to all of us. And I can describe it in really only broad terms. So the initial moves come in the United States under Ronald Reagan, in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher, but Europe follows suit in the 1980s and 1990s. So the governments of the developed political economies retreat from activist state intervention in favor of letting markets allocate a larger share of resources. Through privatization, through deregulation, they intensify competition in multiple markets. And they begin to cut back on the generosity and duration of social benefits. And of course, they ultimately introduce the work requirements that turn welfare into workfare. And of course, in Europe, in Western Europe, much of this was accomplished, you could say, by stealth. Indeed, by the Single European Act of 1986, that in my view, turned the European Commission into an agent for market liberalization. So how are we to explain this new shift from the growth strategy of the era of modernization to the growth strategy of this era of liberalization? Well, once again, I think the motivation lies in adverse, negative economic developments. Developments that give rise to a generalized sense of crisis, and also a closely linked shift in the challenges emanating from the international economy. And of course, the key developments, as anyone who lived through them, as I did, can remember, the key developments were simultaneous increases in levels of unemployment and levels of inflation, the famous stagflation of the 1970s. I have to teach my students these days what inflation actually is, since none of them have experienced it before, but suddenly we're being reminded in a very strong way today about exactly what inflation is. And of course, this inflation in the 1970s was followed by sharply lower rates of economic growth, especially in Western Europe. And I don't need to remind you, I think that this was seen not only as an economic crisis, but as a political crisis. Virtually every government in office at the end of the 1970s was defeated in the subsequent election. This was a period when many people were saying that democracy is somehow ungovernable. Theories of overloaded government were very prominent in the press and academia. And of course, this is when people began to say that Europe was suffering from Eurosclerosis. And of course, the other development in this period that I'm not saying much about that was also important was the removal of exchange controls, so that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s vastly greater flows of capital across international borders. And those flows in turn forced new strategies on many firms. Those firms in turn pressed governments for new policies. So I think the motivation for this shift to a new growth strategy in the era of liberalization lies very much in the economic crisis of the 1970s, which in turn became a political crisis. Now, the means for this shift were supplied, of course, by a set of economic theories, some of them somewhat older, some of them somewhat new, but theories that were suddenly taken off the shelf, developed to provide a rationale for a key set of shifts in policy in the 1980s and 90s. And these are the emerging economic theories of monetarism, on the one hand, associated with Milton Friedman here, and more broadly, a new classical economics built on rational expectations foundations. And these theories were important because they provided a rationale for thinking that activist fiscal and monetary policies of the sort that had been practiced up to that point for the last 20 or 30 years, that activist fiscal and monetary policies had few effects on the real economy, few durable effects. And these are also theories that located the sources of unemployment, not in the patterns of economic management of governments, but rather in the structure of product and labor markets. And of course, governments that were suffering under high levels of unemployment were in some ways happy to see a new set of theories that absolved them of responsibility for that and instead located the sources of unemployment in the character of labor and product markets. So governments felt they had to act. And of course, business interests and their economic advisors were urging governments to move in neoliberal directions in the 1980s and early 1990s. And I think it's fair to say that in the first instance, it's these firms faced with new competitive challenges, pushing governments for new policies that were important here. And of course, economic advisors influenced by this new classical economics. I think that's where we find in the first instance the motive force for this shift to a new set of growth strategies in the 1980s and 90s. But how then does the electoral arena enter this part of the story? Well, for the most part, the liberalizing initiatives of the 1980s and 90s in particular were not very popular. And even when some of those initiatives carried long-term benefits, they also carried very significant short-term costs. They imposed economic precarity, in some cases depressed incomes, on large numbers of people as markets became more competitive and markets became more important for allocating resources. So the question becomes, if these initiatives weren't all that popular, and if they carried some serious costs for many people, why were these initiatives, these neoliberal initiatives, not preempted by electoral pressure? In particular, why weren't they blocked by social democratic parties, center-left parties, parties that had long operated in the name of working class defense? Well, in my view, the answer to that question turns again on the structure of political cleavages and on how political cleavages condition the terms of electoral competition, electoral contestation. So between the 1960s and the 1980s, as I think we all know, the cleavage structures of the Western democracies changed substantially. By the 1980s, as this slide suggests, the class cleavage, which had dominated electoral politics in the 1950s and 60s, was no longer as sharp or as salient to political competition as it had once been. And of course, that's partly because of post-war prosperity, changes in the occupational structure associated with the movement from manufacturing to services had in large measure reduced the economic disparities across social classes, reduced the strong sense of working class grievance that once underpinned this cleavage. So that was one development, a kind of the declining salience of the class cleavage. But equally important, however, was the rise during the 1970s and early 1980s of a new cleavage. In this case, a cultural cleavage focused on what are sometimes called values issues, although they often go well beyond values. And this cultural cleavage separates people with largely post-material or cosmopolitan attitudes oriented to the protection of the environment, to gender equality, to human rights, often tolerance for immigrants. These cosmopolitan attitudes on one side, people with those attitudes find themselves divided from other people with much more traditional attitudes on such issues. And as the political scientist Ronald Inglehart has argued, the roots of this new cleavage also lie in the prosperity experienced by younger generations in the 1950s and 1960s. And so this new cultural cleavage cross-cuts the traditional economic cleavage. You can see this in this slide, which places across a number of European countries, people in different occupational groups in this new two-dimensional electoral space. So instead of an electoral space dominated by the economic axis here, dominated by divisions of social class, we now have and still have a much more fragmented electoral space in which social groups are spread widely along these two axes. And in keeping with this, the terms of electoral contestation changes. Issues of redistribution associated with the class cleavage no longer dominated electoral competition. And instead, cultural issues linked to issues of gender equality, immigration, and the like became increasingly salient to party competition. And that in turn, of course, shifted the strategies of political parties in this new context. Center-left parties began to seek and to attract more middle-class voters on the basis of their stands on cultural issues, as you can see from this slide. So by the 1990s, many European social democratic parties were drawing more of their votes from the middle class than from the working class. And many of those middle-class voters, not all of them, but many of them benefited from some of these policies of liberalization because they had market power and therefore could prosper in an economy in which markets assumed a greater role for allocating resources. And as a result, center-left parties no longer really operated as parties of working class defense. And the result in the 1980s and 90s was that mainstream parties converged to the right on economic issues, as the blue arrow in this slide suggests, much as they converged to the left during the 1950s and 1960s. And the result in the end was that Western electoral systems provided what I would describe as a permissive environment in which governments could accede to pressure from business interests for social and economic liberalization. So the motor for neoliberal reform, as I see it, came from outside the electoral arena, but developments in the electoral arena were central to making it possible for democratic governments to move in neoliberal directions. So let me turn now to what I see as a third era in the history of the developed political economies, which I'm going to describe as an era of knowledge-based growth. Let me turn to the possibility, just the possibility, that we might be seeing a third shift in growth strategies, albeit one that's only still emerging today. So, of course, we've been living through a new technological revolution based on information and communications technology, artificial intelligence, new types of biotechnology. And as a result, over the last 20 years, I think, we've seen the emergence of a new era. And I define it as an era in which the success of a national economy depends increasingly on the extent to which its firms are able to take advantage of this new technology. Some of this technology, of course, dates back certainly to the 1970s, some of it a little bit earlier. But really the internet explodes in the late 1990s, just at the beginning of the new century. And it's really only in the more recent period, I think the last 2 decades or so, that the success of an economy depends to such an extent on the capacity of its firms to take up the new technology. And so the policy regimes of the developed democracies have begun to adjust to this new challenge, at least in marginal terms. So governments are providing new incentives for spending on research and development. They're trying to develop new sources of venture capital. And most importantly, probably, they're increasing the numbers of students enrolled in tertiary education, post-secondary education, in the hope of catching up with this technological change, this skill-biased technological change. In many cases, these steps have been incremental. They don't yet, I think, represent a major break with the policy regimes of the era of liberalization. But over the past 5 years or so, I think we're beginning to see movements that may indicate another major shift in the growth strategies of the developed democracies. And how would I characterize this shift? Well, I would describe it as a turn away from the market-oriented policies of the past 30 years and back toward a more assertive state intervention, back toward, in some cases, more generous social policies. I think you can see it if in the newspapers, in the shifts, maybe in some cases marginal, but in some cases more than that, that governments are making even as I speak. So I think it's reflected in growing enthusiasm for what are often called Green New Deals, designed to address issues of climate change simultaneously with issues of job creation. It's marked by a growing governmental concern with issues of inequality, of the sort reflected in the attempts of the current British government, for instance, a conservative government, to level up, as they call it, reduce the economic disparities between regions. You can see it in the last Japanese electoral campaign of a few months ago, in which the new Japanese government gave great prominence to combating problems of economic inequality. And I think we can see it in the unprecedented willingness of the European Union to issue collective bonds in order to fund major new investment programs, which are now just getting underway, with a view to transforming the European economies into high-tech, sustainable economies. Now, in some cases, these initiatives are still embryonic. They're just being born. But I think they may well mark a new shift in growth strategies. Well, so are we really seeing such a shift? Well, I think we can approach this question by applying the analytical framework that I've just outlined. And we can ask whether the conditions set forth in that framework for a shift in growth strategies, are they present in the world that we see today? Well, the first issue would be, are we seeing something like a motivation for a change in growth strategies? And that means, are we seeing the emergence of a new sense of crisis, a feeling that previous policies have failed, and a feeling with wide political resonance? Well, my answer, my tentative answer, at least to this, would be yes. I think that we are seeing an emerging sense of crisis around two sets of developments. And of course, the first are the significant increases in rates of income inequality and employment insecurity that followed from the neoliberal policies, this era of liberalization that you see in some sense portrayed here in the slide. And the second source for this sense of crisis is, I think, a growing feeling that the world is now facing a serious climate crisis. And to my mind, these developments are the equivalents of the mass unemployment of the 1930s or the stagflation of the 1970s, each of which provided a sense of crisis, provided the motivation for previous shifts in the growth strategy. Now, of course, there's something longstanding, both about the rise of inequality and certainly about the emerging climate crisis. These have been going on for quite some time, but I think it's only in the past few years that these developments have come to be seen in the popular imagination, in particular, in crisis terms. Well, so then we can ask, are the intellectual means for another shift in growth strategies also present today? And again, I think the answer might be yes. I think we see those means most obviously in the growing sophistication of climate science, the growing willingness of climate scientists to associate extreme weather events with climate change itself. But I think the means may also grow. An emerging set of means, at least, are also visible in the numbers of economists who've begun to associate higher levels of income inequality with lower levels of growth, and perhaps most fundamentally in the theories of human capital associated with Gary Becker, James Heckman, and others. Theories of human capital that international organizations have translated into calls for a new approach to social policy that construes social policy not as social insurance, but as social investment. So the means may be there. And so where might we find a motor for this shift to a new growth strategy? Well, once again, I think it lies, if it's there, it lies in the electoral arena, where the emergence of a new cleavage is again shifting the terms of electoral contestation. And broadly speaking, this is a cleavage that separates people who benefit from the new knowledge economy and embrace cosmopolitan values associated with that economy from those who fear that they're losing from the new knowledge economy and who are holding on to more traditional sets of social values. And of course, the key variable separating people on both sides, not the only thing that separates them, but the key variable separating people on the two sides of this cleavage is tertiary education, college education, because college education confers both significant economic advantages in this new technological economy, and of course, usually, not always, it usually also confers cosmopolitan, post-material cultural outlooks. And of course, the most significant reflection of this cleavage is declining electoral support for the older parties of the mainstream center left and center right that you see on one chart here, and rising support for two new types of political groups. On the side of these challenger parties, on one side, there are green parties that are taking an increasing share of the educated electorate. On the other side, there are radical parties of the left and of the radical right, sometimes populist parties, claiming to speak for people who've been left behind by this globalized knowledge economy. And as a result, I think the terms of electoral contestation are changing again. As these challenger parties, green parties on the one hand, radical parties on the other, bring new issues into the center of electoral competition. And of course, for green parties, these are most prominently issues associated with climate change, also with social investment. For right populist parties, of course, these are issues about immigration. And for radical parties of both the right and the left, these are issues about what will be done for those who fear they're being left behind by this new globalized knowledge economy. Well, do these observations yield clear predictions? Can we confidently predict that the growth strategies of the developed democracies are on the brink of another major change? Well, I think they probably are, but there are at least two reasons why we can't be sure. First, seems to me that the intellectual frameworks for a shift in growth strategies, this means, are not yet really adequate. On the one hand, I think governments are relying far too heavily on the idea that if they simply expand the numbers of young people in college education, good jobs are going to emerge for those graduates. And that's probably not the case, as this slide from the work of Ben Ansel and Jane Gingrich indicates. In many countries, including in Spain, young people with a college degree are not always getting the kind of job that in effect requires the skills that are conferred by that kind of degree. So in some ways, I think partly for lack of alternative intellectual means, governments wanting to respond to the challenges of skill bias technological change are relying too heavily on the notion that if we just educate more people, the jobs for them will come. In the long term, that might be true, but as Keynes said, in the long term, we're all dead. We have to live through the short term. And on the other hand, I think that contemporary economic theories also still have far too little to say about what to do for the many people who are not going to have high levels of skills. That's bound to be the case. How are they going to prosper in the context of skill bias technological change? How are those regions of countries that feel left behind going to be somehow made more prosperous? What are the jobs going to look like for the many millions of people who don't necessarily have high levels of skills in these economies? And I think we don't yet have a good answer to that question. There's a danger. The governments need to figure out how to do more than consign these workers to what Marx called the dustbin of history. So that, I think, is the first reason why we can't be entirely confident that we're moving to a new set of growth strategies. The second problem is that the politics of the world we live in is bedeviled by a prominent paradox. On the one hand, I think growing support for parties of the radical right and radical left have taken issues that demand more assertive government intervention right to the top of the political agenda. I've just suggested that. But on the other hand, however, rising support for these parties has fragmented the party systems of many countries. And that in turn is making it much more difficult for countries to assemble the governing coalitions, the cohesive coalitions with capacities for the decisive action that's required if countries are going to meet the economic challenges they face today. You know, the French Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France once said, gouverner, c'est choisir, to govern is to choose. And I think pushed by rebellious parties on their flanks with smaller and smaller majorities or pluralities, many Western governments are finding it increasingly difficult to make these hard choices. In short, I think Western governments are moving toward a new set of growth strategies in the context of this knowledge economy. But as the physicist Niels Bohr and also the American baseball player Yogi Berra both said, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. Now, I want to close today by saying just a few words about what this analysis implies for the relationship between capitalism and democracy that I mentioned at the outset of my remarks. Although relatively enduring, the marriage between capitalism and democracy has always been a difficult one. After all, capitalism is an economic system that runs on inequality, while democracy is a political system dedicated to the principles of equality. Inequality, equality. There's always been a tension between them. And so for 200 years, scholars have been debating which of the two systems dominates the other. Are capitalist economies invariably run by business interests, such that the trappings of democracy are really something like a facade? Or do democratic governments actually control the direction of the economy, sometimes against the wishes of business? And as this slide suggests from two important recent books, those issues have come to public prominence once again. I don't have time to recount the history of these debates. Some, like Marx, have argued that capitalism always dominates democracy, while others, like my colleagues Iverson and Soskis here, argue that democracy generally dominates. But my analysis carries some important implications for how we should think about this issue. And I want to conclude by mentioning two of them. First, I think we need to shift the terms of the debate. Most of the debates about the relationship between capitalism and democracy focus on the basic institutions of the two systems, and therefore assume that the two systems are relatively unchanging, or what's important about the two systems is relatively unchanging over time. But of course, the argument I've just made identifies major changes in the operation of the capitalist economies across three eras: modernization, liberalization, knowledge-based growth, even in the course of 8 post-war decades. European business operates very differently in the 2000s than it did in the 1950s. And I've also suggested that the operation of electoral democracy has shifted significantly across these 8 decades. As new cleavages have replaced older ones, new parties have risen while support for older parties has declined. And the implication should be clear. If capitalism and democracy change substantially over time, the balance of influence between them might also shift over time. So I think to understand the relationship between capitalism and democracy, we can't treat them as immutable systems. We can't focus only on the core institutions that define each system. We have to incorporate into our analyses a sense of how capitalism and democracy change over time. And of course, that raises the issue, what sorts of changes matter most to the balance of influence between capitalism and democracy? And that takes me to my second point. In the analysis that I presented, what matters most are changes in the structure of political cleavages and the way in which those change the terms of electoral contestation. In other words, bringing some issues to the center of political debate while relegating others to its margins, and thereby pushing governments of any partisan hue in one direction or another. So when a cleavage based on social class was the most prominent cleavage during the era of modernization, political parties on both the center left and the center right moved to give priority to distributive issues. They didn't hesitate to engage in assertive state intervention, despite opposition from business interests. And they did so on behalf of a broader public. By contrast, during the subsequent era of liberalization, when the salience of the class cleavage had declined and it was cross-cut by this strong cultural cleavage, center-left parties no longer had strong incentives to operate as parties of working class defense. And so influence shifted away from the electoral arena toward what I would call the arena of producer group politics, where labor and business contend for influence and where business is almost always more influential than labor. So if democracy dominated capitalism during the 1950s and 60s during this era of modernization, I would say that in the subsequent era of liberalization, capitalist forces acquired more influence over policy, certainly, and over the direction of the economy relative to democratic forces. So just what will this balance of influence look like in this new era of knowledge-based growth? Well, I don't think we know for sure what that's going to look like. On the one hand, some of the strategies, some of the policies taken during the previous era to shift influence away from the electoral arena, influence over policy away from the electoral arena into independent agencies, insulated from democratic pressure, the European Commission to some degree, certainly independent central banks to some degree. Well, many of those initiatives are still in place. On the other hand, as I've noted, the rising prominence of this new cleavage between the winners and losers of the knowledge economy may yet lead governments to take more assertive action, even in the face of some opposition from business. So, of course, these are complicated issues. Much more could be said about them, but I've already, I think, spoken long enough. If you want further elaboration of these arguments, there are some articles that make for very good bathroom reading. I recommend them to you. You can find them here or on my Harvard website. And I think there's no doubt we'll be debating these issues for some years to come. Thank you very much.
It has really a lot of food for thought, many issues that would certainly inspire questions, but we'll be having, I hope, in the future other opportunities to pursue these really very interesting issues that you put here on the table. May I, I was wondering whether it would be possible just to ask you very briefly one question. Do you think that this new trend towards stakeholder capitalism, including environment, the social, corporate governance from the side of businesses, but also reflecting a certain cultural change in values, could be one of the factors affecting a new dynamic within Western capitalism?
Yes, I think that's definitely possible. I mean, it's a very good question. It's a very challenging question. I think none of us have a crystal ball that tells us for sure what the answer would be. But I think if we look at the dynamic here, we see not only that government policies are beginning to shift, but we also see firm strategies are beginning to shift. Many firms are increasingly concerned about how sustainable their practices are from the point of view of climate change and the environment. I think that it's not only, when I think about the relationship between capitalism and democracy, although I've talked mainly about governments today, about the growth strategies, the policies that governments adopt, I do think that firms are the other important agent of adjustment in capitalist economies. Really, governments on the one side responsive to electorates, firms on the other side responsive to changes in markets. And I think we're seeing on both sides a recognition that we can no longer ignore climate change on the one hand, and we need to think harder and do more about the inequalities that have risen so dramatically over the past 30 years.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and all the best to you, to your work, and all the best also at Harvard, Cambridge, Massachusetts, a place that certainly we always look at inspiring us very much. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all the work the Foundation is doing to support the social sciences and the natural sciences. It's important. Thank you again.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.